BS Free Witchcraft is a production of the Nerd and Tie Podcast Network. Nerd and Tie produces podcasts ranging from actual play to true crime, and you can find more at nerdandtie.com or join our Discord by going to nerdandtie.com/Discord. Welcome to BS Free Witchcraft, your monthly guide to the modern witchcraft movement, minus a lot of the usual, bullshit. I'm your host, Trey Dorn. It's May of 2024, and I am coming to you not from my normal studio, but from the front seat of my truck. Because, like last year, I did not have a chance to record the episode before going on vacation to the cabin in the woods on the lake, and I am having to record it while on said vacation in the cabin in the woods on the lake. But I'm not recording it from inside the cabin because my wife is still asleep, and I will wake her up. Because, for those of you who read the title might have surmised, I might not be exactly quiet this episode. But before we get into that whole thing, we do have a little bit of housekeeping. I like to be good about that. Two things. First and foremost is my annual feedback and Q&A episode is coming up in July. And I need your questions. We've got a couple, but I want more. I always want more. So if you have a question that you want to ask or feedback for the show that you want to hear read aloud on the show, you can go to bsforwitchcraft.com/contact. Remember that any submissions, they are anonymized. We do not say your name, so if you're nervous about that, don't worry. Just go to bsforwitchcraft.com/contact, fill out the form, tell me what you want to know, and I will talk about it on the show, probably. No guarantee, but probably. So that's the first thing. Second off, for those of you who remember my first novel, The Witch and the Rose, came out back in January, and its sequel, Bloody Damn Right, is coming out on June 11th. It's available for pre-order on Kindle ebook right now. It will be available on Amazon in paperback on June 11th, and a couple of days after that for other bookstores. So, that is a thing, and I promise I won't talk about that more, except for maybe at the end of the episode. But we're not here to talk about my books this month. We're here to talk about this one, The Celtic Goddess Grimoire by Annwyn Avalon. Well, sort of. We're going to talk about this book, and we're going to talk about a problem I have with a lot of witchcraft books. Because, again, if you've read the title to the episode, I think you maybe know where this is going. So I don't know what happened within the last few months, but I must have ended up on somebody's mailing list. Because while this show sat quiet for years, suddenly, without warning, I have been inundated with emails from a couple of different publishers and authors asking for interviews or for book reviews, and I don't know why. And I severely get the feeling that some of these people, if not all of these people, have never listened to this show. Because I feel like, here's the thing, I don't respond to most of these emails, but I read all of them, and I've been looking into most of them, and I get the feeling that these people aren't familiar with what I do here, or the tone, or the vibe that we have on the show, or else these people would not be offering their sacrificial lambs to me, which I have not taken them up on. There's a reason why this is not an interview. I have not asked anyone to be on the podcast with me out of all of these emails. Because I am a kind soul. I may be a curmudgeon. I may be angry and annoyed with what a lot of things that are happening in the witchcraft publishing world and have been for decades. But I am not going to bring someone on this show for me to embarrass them or humiliate them or to mock them or belittle them. That's a dick move. Like, I'm not that person. I'm not that person. However, when you offer to send me a copy of your book, no strings attached, no stipulations, no contract, no agreement, I might take you up on it. And I will read it, because I read this book. I spent a chunk of my vacation sitting by the lake reading this book. And it certainly is a book. Now, I know that this may end up burning me some bridges. I know that there is a chance that I was never going to publish a witchcraft book. What are you talking about? I'm writing books, but I'm not writing. I'm too angry to write a witchcraft book. I'm too disorganized. I have too high standards to write the book. Here, I have very high standards, what I think makes a witchcraft book good. Incredibly high. There's a reason why, if you listen to this show, I have never recommended more than 3 books in the history of it. There's a reason for that. And this one's a good example why. So, if anybody in the publishing industry is actually listening to this show and listening to this episode, please let this be a lesson before you throw your authors onto the fire. Because we're going to talk about Celtic Goddess Grimoire. Oh, we're going to talk about it. So, this is a book by Annwyn Avalon, who I'm just going to read you her author bio from the back of this book. And you can maybe figure out why I had bad vibes off of this book immediately, before they sent it to me. Annwyn Avalon, a water priestess and Celtic witch, is the founder of Water Priestess Training, the Water Priestess Confluence, and Triskele Rose Witchcraft, an Avalonian witchcraft tradition. She has devoted her life to the study of esoteric water mysteries, art, witchcraft, and magic. The author of Water Witchcraft and The Way of the Water Priestess, she has written for the Magical Times magazine and Witchology magazine, and has contributed to other publications such as Bridget's Light and The New Aradia. Annwyn writes the Pathos blog, The Water Witch. She lives in Glastonbury as the sacred steward of Chalice Orchard, the former home of acclaimed occultist Dion Fortune. Annwyn serves as a keeper at the White Spring, one of Glastonbury's sacred springs. Find her at and then website and Instagram. We're invoking Dion Fortune immediately. When we see someone invoke the name of Dion Fortune uncritically, it's just a red flag to begin with. I mean, we're talking about Dion Fortune, someone who pretty much said that non-white people couldn't do magic. We're ill-prepared for like psychic powers. It's so... The racism there. Oh, God. But let's go into what she actually wrote here. So the structure of this book is pretty straightforward. We start with an introduction, the mandatory introduction where someone tells personal witchcraft stories and or pretty much their journey into witchcraft, starting with their childhood and how they were always called to magic and blah 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 blah. This is so cliche, it actually hurts me to read it. It's interesting, I don't believe at any point in this introduction she mentions that she is American. I don't think she's hiding this, not at all. Like, if you pull up her LinkedIn, it's obvious that she's American. It's interesting that as a book that mentions that she lives in Glastonbury and goes into that much, there's no mention of the fact that this is an American woman. So I think that's fascinating. Not even in the introduction where she's talking about like a childhood story does that come up. And I find that fascinating and bizarre. Like, I don't think she's necessarily hiding it, but I do believe that for some reason that leads to like kind of the inauthenticity of some, I don't know. There's this belief that things that are from like that things that are actually from like the UK or from Ireland or from like the Celtic regions like so France that are more authentic. Things that are European are more authentic because they're old world, and I don't think that's true, but I feel like it's just like this tiny little bias of never bringing it up. It's just very telling to me, right? So after the personal story intro, we get, a couple of introduction chapters about Celtic spirituality, as she defines it, and we'll get into my thoughts on that. And then the rest of this book, so that's through like page 21, and then the rest of this book is effectively short write-ups on a number of different goddesses from across all the Celtic regions. So Ireland, Scotland, Wales, France, like things like that. Because again, the Celtic region is pretty diverse. And herein lies my first problem out of the gate. Why does this book exist? See, this book is a collection of some very diverse things. Now, when we talk about Celtic, that region is defined mostly by a shared language, variations on Gaelic, a couple of different linguistic families that are kind of like shared throughout the area. And that's kind of what defines it. But it's not like, there's not a pan-Celtic culture. In the modern world, one's kind of tried to begin to develop, like as people have found like Celtic identities, like that's why bagpipes and kilts have spread, like even into like France, parts of France, because like, yeah. The idea behind this book of presenting this is just bizarre, and it's so bizarre that on page 1 of chapter 1, she pretty much admits it. The first line in chapter 1, after her personal intro, is, "There is no such thing as a single Celtic pantheon." That is the first line of this book once you get past the intro. And she says it in a couple of different ways at a couple of different times. It is right here. She is admitting that this entire book doesn't really make sense as an exercise. That to create a catalog, she admits immediately, we are decontextualizing these figures. In the first sentence of chapter 1. This is ridiculous. And as I read this book and I dug through its context, the more and more it bothered me, because I don't know if the subtitle of this book is "Invoke the Enduring Power of the Celtic Feminine Divine." And divine feminine is a phrase you're going to see a lot in this book. And it is this I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because I actually want to go through a couple of things. Other problems I have with this book, before I get to the fact that there's flaws in the very premise, is on page Roman numeral 11, because it's in the introduction chapter. As I'm checking my notes here, She claims that she really wanted to write a scholarly book on goddesses. And she says, and I quote, "But as I wrote, I found that the pressure of producing the perfect presentation of each goddess was simply not going to work. There was too little information about some of them and too much about others. Some had long stories, and others were known only from a single inscription. How could I write something that would do each goddess justice? How could the words I would weave on the page begin to describe these magnificent beings adequately? How could I even include all the goddesses who are connected to the Celtic landscape?" She goes on to pretty much talk about how hard it is to categorize goddesses and whether or not she should do it by what she admits effectively in this introduction is that there aren't scholarly sources for most of this. And herein lies a major problem. Here's the thing, guys. I am not an expert on Celtic mythology. I am not familiar with a lot of Irish folklore. I'm not familiar with a lot of Scottish. My knowledge falls more into the Norse and Greek, right? With a little bit of Egypt. Just from like various interests throughout childhood and things. I'm not. My background, we're Germans and Swedes. Swedish is like the biggest part of my family. So like I never got into like the whole Celtic revival stuff because it never like clicked with me. So like I've never read the Mabinogi, so I don't know Welsh folklore all that well. So here's the thing. I can't fact check any of these like write-ups on different goddesses. And reading this book did not make that better. Because here's the thing. While this book does have a bibliography and a list of sources, which is good, I applaud her for that, doing that much. What it's not is a work cited. So there is no clear indication in the text where any particular information came from. To complicate matters, as she admits in the introduction, she is sometimes giving her interpretations of things, right? And also there are some things like there are some things that are debated by scholars, and she's just going to provide one point of view for all of these and state it as fact, without saying whose theory it is, whose argument it is. It's like, again, there is a bibliography, which is better than nothing, but it's, as she admits, that there isn't a lot of information on some of these goddesses and that she had to explain. It isn't like, you don't get to a section on a goddess and it's like, here's the historical record, here's what we know, and then here's my interpretation of that. You don't get that. You don't get a, hey, these are the things we know about, X goddess from folklore. Here are the things that people debate. Here's what's not agreed upon. No, you get the story. And you get like a page and a half. And you can never tell what came from a scholarly source, what came from a contested scholarly source, what came from somebody who was debating where are the disagreements? Because you and I know, if you've studied history and you've gone back to primary sources, when you get back into especially this, cultures that were primarily oral traditions, and that oral tradition has been lost, right? It's like, I'm not talking about indigenous groups that still pass on their oral traditions. I'm talking about Western, we don't know what the Druids did because the Druids didn't write stuff down, and then it was lost because of the church, right? And there are write-ups from the church. I mean, the Mabinogi itself is written by a Christian source, right? It's having to document things. So it's like, context. We need context. This is a book stripped of context. This entire book, nothing is truly giving context, because by its very premise, and I think some of you may have figured this out, this is a list of goddesses taken out of context and collected into an index. And that's it. There is not while there are stories and descriptions of these goddesses in this book, they are short, they are brief, and they take these goddesses out of their stories and self-select and try to recontextualize. Because often, if you read this intro, you get her talking about God being a woman connecting to the feminine divine, and she talks about how the Celts revered women, and then just talks about how in some Celtic societies they had equal status with men, which is an interesting way to frame it, because she's talking about the quote-unquote importance of the divine feminine in these cultures, but framing it only as the divine feminine. Whether conscious or unconscious, she is trying to recontextualize the Celtic nations as a matriarchal, pan-Celtic culture. She says she's not. She says she's not trying to present it as pan-Celtic, and that you can't group these people together. But just because you say it 3 times doesn't mean that's not the message the book is sending. Right? You can hang the lampshade, but that doesn't cancel out the trope. Y'all, it is giving Margaret Murray. It is giving Margaret Murray. I took notes throughout the first couple of chapters. Just eventually had to give up because it kept coming back to the same rant. Context is like what drives me nuts, though, and this is a problem not just with this book, but is the decontextualization of everything. When we get to our first exercise on page 25, after talking about going to scholarly sources, talking about these goddesses, and trying to get to like how we're talking about this from a historical context, the first exercise that we get on page 25 is pure transcendental magic. A completely modern form of witchcraft that is really very, very, very much brought about from Wicca, right? Like this book does not claim to be Wiccan. There is nothing really about Wicca in this book, but our first exercise is a form of magic that comes straight out of Wiccan practices. There is no historical context for this kind of magic at all. And in a book that claims to be going back to scholarly sources, to immediately start with that, look, we're talking about modern practitioners, right? There is nothing wrong with a modern practitioner who has faith in these deities using modern witchcraft techniques. In fact, yay, great. Witchcraft is a living practice. Change, update, do that. Awesome. But if you're writing a source that claims to be going back to scholarly sources, I feel like you owe the reader the context that this is a modern spell technique. I feel like you owe the reader that much, because I am a witch who has been practicing for over 25 years. I've read a lot of junk. I have read good, I know the history of all of this. I know. But odds are a lot of readers are going to pick up this book with no fucking idea. And you're bringing in types of magic that would not have been. You try to present things as traditional. You try to present things as old, but then use modern techniques without explaining that. That's not. How hard is it to say in a sentence that the magical techniques listed in this book are not going to be traditional? Because you have written a book where 90%, there is variation in the magical exercises, but 90% of the exercises in this are based off of spell techniques from within the last 100 fucking years. Yet, here we are. Like, the lack of context in this book is a massive problem. Like, on page 30, there is a list of color associations for different candles. Out of nowhere. No citations, no explanations. Where do these color correspondences come from? I don't know. You don't know either. It's not in the book. Maybe somewhere in that one page of bibliography in the back, there is some source that lists that where that's from. Like, maybe there is some citation in the back of this book that I'm unaware of, but they're out of nowhere. And again, almost every color correspondence is something that some witch made up once. And you can go listen to my candles episode for my whole rant on this bullshit. But I feel like it's just slapped in there. And because there is no direct citation for any of the things in this book, it is presented with the same authority as everything else. It is presented with the same authority as all the stuff that's supposedly backed up by historic record. Because again, I can't fact check that because I don't know that stuff. But I know this stuff. I know when I run across a transcendental magic ritual that it came because fucking Wiccans loved that shit. I know, I'm a Wiccan. We love that shit. But it ain't traditional. When you present these things with the same authority, without directly citing or saying where they come from, or without presenting that context, you are doing a disservice to readers, you are doing a disservice to everybody. I mean, my first red flag in this book, I should really say, my very first red flag, not like from like before I read it, but like reading this book, is on the first page of the introduction. The first page of the introduction, there is a sentence where she says, "Now, as a priestess, I understand the deep symbology here, and also chuckle when I look at my personal practice and how it surrounds the watery moon and solar goddesses." Deep symbology. I need to explain something. Put that down there. Symbolism and symbology are two different words with two different meanings. Symbolism would be what something represents, right? Symbology is the study of symbols. Annwyn. And Annwyn's editor, who needs to maybe step up things a little bit. Symbolism is the word you wanted in that sentence, not symbology. You have used the incorrect word in the first paragraph on the first page of the introduction to this book. Now, I understand. As someone who has had to do some editing, I could miss that. But I would hope that maybe somewhere down the line, someone would have read the first paragraph on the first page of the introduction to a book. And this book does something that many witchcraft books do. And this is where I have a problem with not just Annwyn or Weiser Books or Weiser, I don't know how to pronounce the publisher name, Weiser Books. Llewellyn has this problem. Every witchcraft publisher has this problem. The books I'm reading, when I pick them up, the author comes from a very I'm special vibe. And it comes with a premature buy-in. And this comes from a tone that I also see not just in witchcraft books, not just in pagan books, but it's a tone I see in Christian books. This buy-in for the faith. This assumption that we've all bought in already. Complete lack of any sort of skepticism. Which is important. If you're writing a Christian book, it's fine. You're selling to people who have already bought in. But you're selling a book about separate pantheons of goddesses who you are homogenizing into a single one. And you're presuming that a person who believes in one of these goddesses would believe in all of these goddesses, which is not universally true. Because, as you note, at least 3 different times in this book, these are separate cultures and pantheons. These are separate cultures and pantheons, and you are treating them like they are one by the very organization. This is a book that, whether it is conscious or unconscious, has an agenda to elevate the divine feminine. In fact, I mean, it's hard to argue that it's not conscious, but it excludes, it decontextualizes a set of goddesses and tries to group them effectively into a singular pantheon, even though it's claiming it's not. Because again, just because you hang the lampshade doesn't mean you're not still doing it. It's doing that. And there are going to be people who pick up this book, who don't know better, who haven't done the research, who don't understand the complexities of this folklore, who, like me, have not read the Mabinogi, who have not looked up individual Celtic cultures and looked up their folklore or researched them. This will be their first exposure to many of these things. In this mass-produced witchcraft book, where almost every spell is based off of something that is wholly modern, yet presents itself as traditional. This fundamentally misunderstands or deliberately misinterprets so much history and culture into a single book that it is ridiculous. And, she spends so much time in this intro trying to explain her natural wonder with the world and her connection to the feminine divine that like, okay, this is just a side note. Like, look, don't tell me about your childhood. I don't care. You don't care about mine. And I admit I did an episode early on in this podcast where I talked about my personal witchcraft journey. Absolutely I did. But it was to contrast someone else's very different one, right? Like, it was like, I'm like this, but this person's like this, and this is how we're doing, but look, it's very good to establish your bona fides at the beginning, but I don't need to know about your religious trauma with the Christian church to start off, right? And I think that this is really indicative that somebody hasn't deconstructed their religious trauma because a lot of the way they talk about faith and spirituality feels very much the Christian mindset. Like, I had to find out more about this person. And so, like, I ended up listening to some podcasts with her, reading some stuff. Like, this is a book that fetishizes a pan-Celtic culture that does not exist, even while simultaneously claiming that it doesn't. This is a bad book. And you should not read it. I hated this book. Don't even hate buy it. Don't buy this book. And now I know Weiser or however you pronounce this publisher, which has an Ankh for a logo. I've got thoughts. Don't buy this book. And they'll, I don't know if they'll listen to this episode or this review, but maybe, just maybe, don't buy this book. Like, okay, so here's the thing. I'm like, how did I get this? Like, and I know that the reason why I got sent this and why I'm getting these emails is because they're expecting a typical, here's some behind the curtain stuff, right? Most witchcraft podcasts like mine, we have an audience. Like, obviously this podcast is not my full-time job. I have a day job. Y'all know this. Well, some of you know this, but I have a day job, right? I have a regular 9-to-5 job, office job, and I do this for fun. I don't need to do this show. Like, but a lot of people who do podcasts, most podcasts are hobbies, right? The vast majority. Very few people, like, if you look at it's the long tail, right? Or you got like some people are like really popular and then it tapers off and then like you get this long tail of like little shows like mine. And little shows like mine, like we've got, thousands of listeners still. But, thousands of listeners brings in, not a ton of money. Like, I could run ads, but I don't think it would be enough money to make it worth ruining the show. I mean, I'm plugging my own shit enough already. I'm not going to subject you guys to a sponsor read in the middle of that. I'm proud. Yeah, that's like this is no shade on people who do run ads. Like, obviously, like I'm a big fan of Hex Positive, which is also on this network. Bree runs ads. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just honestly too lazy to work with advertisers on that. But most of us are small time. Now, publishers know this. Publishers know that we're small time. Publishers still want to get to our thousands of listeners. The witchcraft publishing world is not big. The reason why I have not torn into books before is because the witchcraft publishing world is not big. There are several well-known published witchcraft authors who follow me, of all people, on TikTok. The world ain't big. These books, while there are some witchcraft authors who are able to work professionally just publishing witchcraft books, most of them don't. Like, even some of the big names that you know of have day jobs, right? And so getting books out is make or break. Like, getting it out to as many people as possible is huge. And so they try to promote just little shows like mine. You know, we've got a couple thousand listeners. They try to promote the shows like mine because most people who do these little hobby shows aren't weird cranks like me. They're not. Most of these people make their shows out of passion, where I started mine out of spite. I started mine because I got tired of people who were just needlessly, uncritically, happily describing things, and who were talking to writers who wrote things that I thought were maybe a little problematic. Like, and I don't know how I got to this weird position where, like, I've done episodes, like I did an episode with Aidan Kelly, of all people. Like, that is the infamous figure in the witchcraft world. But we think critically, right? Like, we get critical, we get mad. I get, like, my whole thing on this show is criticizing the problems, but most shows aren't like that. Most shows, if the writer of a book wants to come on their show, they're excited that the writer of the book wants to come on their show, or their publicist, or the publicist for their publisher, in this case, who sent me this book. They're flattered by getting a review copy. They're flattered by getting access to these writers. So they do. And they bring them on. And they're not critical of them. They're fawning over someone who they perceive as it's flattering. Now, celebrity culture kind of broke down for me a long time ago when I was a teenager working conventions and met some of my science fiction heroes. And Timothy Zahn yelled at me for 5 minutes when I was like 16 years old for something that I had nothing to do with. And I just had to sit there and let him yell at me. Timothy Zahn, on the off chance you ever watch this random podcast thing. I remember I was a teenager volunteering at Gen Con, and you yelled at me for like 5 minutes before I could get a word in edgewise and get you to an actual, like, full staff member. It's a weird fucking experience. I did not go get my copy of Heir to the Empire signed that year. Or the Conqueror's Trilogy at Gen Con. No. But so, like, I got over that as a teenager. And I don't know if you see the gray in this beard if you're watching the video version. I ain't a teenager anymore. Writers, celebrities, these people are people. People are going to people. There are people I respect for what they've done in this world, but in the end, people are people. I am not flattered by anything because someone who I idolized as a teenager yelled at me out of nowhere. So, spell's been broken. But it has not been broken for many people. And so they get flattered, and they bring these people on, and they do these uncritical reviews, and they do these interviews where they are just happy to have anybody on their show, right? Anybody on their podcast. And publishers know this. And these podcasts, like, even if they're small shows like mine with, like, again, like, this show is, there are shows smaller than mine. Like, there are shows that have tens of listeners and hundreds of listeners. So, like, I'm in a very fortunate position with my thousands. Like, when I talk about my show being small, I am very grateful to every person who tunes into this show every month and listens and watches and all of that. Like, it is very flattering. It is very helpful for me. And I love you guys. And I know that I'm in a privileged position where this show pays for itself thanks to the support on Patreon. Like, I can't live off of this, but the cost of producing the show and hosting the show and all that stuff is all covered. this, this hobby of mine pays for a nice dinner once a month. But as these shows add up, especially if you go to my level, like where you got a couple thousand listeners, a couple thousand listeners makes a huge difference for a witchcraft book, right? Like, that kind of promotion makes a huge difference in this world. So they reach out to people like me, and they're expecting all positive reviews. They're not expecting a negative review, because especially and that's actually why, especially if they bring the authors on, how many people are going to bring on an author onto their show, which will bring them listeners, which will bring them popularity, bring them credibility, and lay into them. Even I'm not willing to do that, which is why I don't bring them on the show. I am criticizing Annwyn Avalon's book. I cannot see a world in which I would bring her onto this show and fawn over her and be polite and be nice. Well, I'd be polite, but I would not be nice. There's a huge difference. I would confront her about every single thing I brought up in this episode. And she might be offended. She might be mad. She might disconnect the call immediately. Or maybe she'd sit and maybe she'd argue. But it would not be a positive experience for her. It would not be a positive experience for me. So we don't do it. We don't play those games. We don't do that to people. But if you send me a book, this is just a warning. The publisher's publicist, if you send me a book, I am going to give you my honest thoughts. And it's not what you're expecting, right? Because again, this is a small world. We think we're big in the witchcraft world, but the fact is, we're not. We are still just a fragment of the population. So when a couple of thousand listeners makes a big difference in the promotion of a book, they're going to send it out to people like me, and they're going to expect something positive in this culture. And it's not going to happen when you get to me. But it will happen with everybody else, which is how I got grouped in here. Let me tell you how much they don't listen to the show, some of these people who send me stuff. One of my most recent emails said how they would like their author to be on what a great job I'm doing on No BS Witchcraft. If you can't get the name of my show correct in your email, you have guaranteed to me that you have never listened to an episode and don't know what you are going to subject your poor author to. Because I suspect, I have not read that person's book. I'm not mentioning the name or the publisher, but I suspect it was a different publisher than this person. So it's because I've been getting emails from a couple of different publishers. It was not the publisher's email, but I suspect that person has not watched the show, has not listened to the show, and does not know what they would be feeding people into. So yeah, don't buy this book. Don't buy any of Annwyn Avalon's books. That's what I'm saying. That's what I can definitively say from this episode. This is not a good book. This is a bad book. It's playing Margaret Murray. It's playing Margaret Murray because we're talking about trying to develop a just Celtic region instead of pan-European. So we've narrowed it down a little bit. But idea of the feminine divine, the divine feminine, which is goddess movement red flags, but it's trying to create an ahistorical pan-Celtic feminine divine and rewrite history. And that is bad. Don't do that. Okay, so to wrap up the show, went a little longer this month. To wrap up the show, I do want to remind you that the show is brought to you by lovely listeners on Patreon. I want to give a shout out to the people at the shout out level of Lindsay Dosey, Bruce Norville, Courtney, Claire Dennis, Caleb Burkowski, Simon Geringer, and Pamela Stariak. I don't know if that list is accurate because I'm in the woods And to upload this episode, I'm going to have to go about 300 feet that way and get the Wi-Fi. Because I don't get it in my cabin. And the cellular doesn't really work, so I can't really check Patreon right now. My internet connection has been, like, it'll work for like 30 minutes, and so you'll see me, like, post a bunch of stuff on Tumblr. But anyways, yeah. If you want to support this show and get it a whole week early, you can go there and at patreon.com/TRAEGORN. I am so loosey-goosey right now. If you can't afford to support the show financially, that is fine. Consider sharing the show to your friends on social media. Remember, you can follow me on social media at TRAEGORN on Tumblr primarily, but also on Twitter. Technically, I have a Mastodon and a Threads, but I hardly ever use them. And I'll put those up on the screen in the video version, but yeah, whatever. If you want to follow me on Facebook, it's facebook.com/BSFreeWitchcraft. Do not try to find my personal page. Because that's where I talk to my mom. But yeah, and remember, we are doing the feedback episode in a couple of months in July. So please send in your questions using the form at bsfreewitchcraft.com/contact. bsfreewitchcraft.com/contact. Remember, bsfreewitchcraft.com is where you can find all the links to follow this on things like Spotify, Apple Music. Please, rate and review on places like Apple Podcasts. That'd be great because your reviews help promote the show. And yeah, that's it. Remember, we are a part of the Nerd and Tie Podcast Network. Remember, if you want to socialize with us, we have a Discord at nerdandtie.com/discord, or you can join us on the nerdandtie.social forums. Other great shows on this network include Hex Positive, hosted by Brina Guerin, the writer of Grove Daughter Witchery, a witchcraft book I actually like. And you can check that show out at nerdandtie.com/hex. And Bree, I know, would really appreciate any purchases from her witchcraft shop, and there are links there. With that, Magicians, I bid you a fond adieu. Remember, Bloody Damn Right comes out June 11th. Pre-order the Kindle ebook or order the paperback in a couple weeks, and that comes out. And just remember, dirt in our fingernails, brick in our hands. I'll talk to you, Magicians, next month.